Hey, what's going on? Todd Shaw with another episode of the Sawdust Dude. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you so much. Hey, I got a question for you. Listen, does this saw intimidate you? Does it? Hey, let's talk about the circular saw real quickly. This is probably like the carpenter's or the handyman, woodworker's right-hand man. This is probably a go-to tool that this is one of the first tools that you need. Let me just put it that way. The 7 1/4 circular saw. You'll hear a lot of these referred to as a skill saw, but no, it's a circular saw. Skill is actually a brand, and so skill is kind of like when somebody says, say, hey, you got any Windex? Windex is a glass cleaner, but because they've branded it so well, we call all glass cleaner Windex. So you've got a 7 1/4 inch blade on this circular saw. How do I know that? Well, because I've been using one for over 40 years, but also it's got it right here on the sticker. So if your product label is missing, chances are that's kind of a across the board standard for all circular saws. It's a 7 1/4 inch blade. So you can kind of see how the saw over the years hasn't really changed. It's changed for the better. This is a Porter cable. So I started saying skill saw. A Porter cable circular saw that's from the 1950s. This thing is like a brick. If you use this on the job site, you'd have arms like Popeye. You'd be like, yeah. So you can see it on the front, how it really hasn't changed that much. You've got your adjustment here to cut at a bevel or an angle, and then this one here on the back, you can also adjust the deck height. So from 1950 something to 2000 and something, the saws have remained the same. They're just lighter and work better. So as I was saying, on the front of the saw up here, you've got your angles. So this thing will cut up to like a 57-degree angle. Now on this particular model here, there are 2 ways to read what degree you're on. You've got numbers here, and that's indicated by this little arrow right here. And so we want to cut, say, a 45, and then that's a 45-degree angle right there. But also it gives you a reading. There are numbers on here, and then inside this tab is also where you can read your 45 degrees, and so right there. So I've got numbers here and I've got numbers here, which somebody would say that's kind of overkill. Well, I say it's kind of a good insurance policy to have, to make sure that you're on the right degrees and right angles. But what you always want to do when you pick up the saw, get ready to use it, make sure that it is kind of zeroed out and that you've got a 90-degree angle here on the bed of your saw. Now, anytime that you're working around the blade, or how I'll just have my fingers around there, you always want to make sure that it's unplugged. That's just common shop safety. Shop safety when you're using a saw, when you're working or changing out the blades, you make sure you want it unplugged. Number 2, you always want to make sure that your work area is nice and clean, and that way you don't want to trip over, because these saws can kick back. The blade kind of spins back towards you, and if it were to get bind up in the wood, it will kick back. That's why I never stand really squared up to it. I kind of stand with my right foot back. I'm right-handed, so I kind of stand back this way. That way if the saw kicks back, guess what? I'm out of the way. I always hold on to the saw, and from in here, I just let go of the trigger from in here, and just keep the saw in my hand if it kicks back, and then just guide it away from my leg. Well, let's talk about another thing about safety, and that's the blade guard here. Sometimes the spring inside will break, and you really need to get that replaced. DeWalt does sell replacement parts online, real easy to get them. And all you have to do is remove the blade, and you'll see a little spring inside there to figure out how it works. But you always want to make sure that blade guard is functional, because if that were to kick back, you don't want that blade to go right and fillet your thigh, or or do an appendectomy on you or anything like that. And I don't say that to scare you. I just say that to give you the confidence to use this thing with wisdom. And we talked about the front up here and about how to get your angles. But most of the time you're doing a 90-degree cut. So let's talk about this bottom one back here. So from in here, you flip this lever up and you can adjust the height of your cut. All the way closed like this. This saw will cut about 2.5 inches thick. So from in here, you could cut a board 2.5 inches right at, it's like 2 5/8. So 2.5 easy, and that'll give you a little clearance there on the bottom. But so what if you were just cutting like a 1/2 inch piece of plywood? And so what you want to do to have a better cut, I just take my tape measure in here, do it to about 3/4. Move it like that, lock it in place, and then I take a piece of 1/2 inch wood, and now I can make my cut effectively, and it will just cut through the bottom there. That way it's a more efficient and clean cut. But let's talk about that. Got to bring this to another point when we're talking about cutting. What I like to do a lot of times, if I'm cutting, instead of cutting on my surface here, see, I've got my Craig work table, this top here, and if you look around, well, here's a spot, and I think that's the only spot, but I thought I was cleared, and I actually kind of cut into my work surface. It happens to the best of us. I don't care how long you've been doing it. I've seen squares and things like that were just laid up on the table. People take a piece of wood and then all of a sudden they're cutting through their square. You know, it happens to the best of it, but always make sure your work surface is nice and clean, and make sure, this is what I love to do. If I'm cutting a piece of wood like this, I'll lay down a couple pieces of sacrificial lumber, and that way I've got a nice steady surface, nice, it's not rocking, not moving around. Then I can take my saw and then make my cut. And so it's a nice clean surface. So I've got my mark where I want to start. So we just do that. And then I take my square. And then I make my line here. And so I know I want to leave that line. So I'm going to take my saw blade and line it up over here just like this. Now on this particular saw, you can go off this little mark right here, and it's got that tab right there. And everybody likes to do it a little bit differently. Some guys peek through this window here. Sometimes I like to look over this way, or you can follow the mark there, and then you just make your cut. Now before you squeeze that trigger, make sure that the blade is away. I kind of move it up, make sure that I'm lined up, and then I back my blade off of the wood. Because if I leave it there and I touch the trigger, it'll kick back, or it'll rip out the side of the wood. So just kind of take your saw blade and move up, and then back off a little bit. Make sure that I'm moving, I'm pushing straight ahead. I got my elbow out, keep my elbow in, and just keep moving. So from here, and I squeeze the trigger, and then I just keep pushing straight. I keep my elbow kind of in. If you keep your elbow out, it kind of makes you want to push out. Remember, I've got my good angle in case if it kicks back. So those are some tips there when you start cutting. You can also take a square, kind of line it up here. I line up my saw, that's where I want to be. I can take my square here and use it as a straight edge and kind of push along that way. And that'll get me a nice straight cut all the way through that board, even with a small speed square, or you can use a larger framing square. So those are just some of the tips there when you're cutting. But let's talk about some of this when you're using that board. If you're cutting a long board. Now if I cut a board off this way, and that's called a cross cut, because I'm cutting across the grains. And say I got a 2x4 or 2x6 in this situation, and I just need to cut a couple inches off. I'm going to take take this Speedy Square, and I'm going to cut those 3 inches off of that, and just from here, and just rip that down, or just cross cut that. Now, if I cut a board long ways, this is called ripping it down. If I had to go all the way down like this, I'm going to rip that board down to a certain size. So that's a cross cut, and that's a rip. Cross cut cuts across the grain, a rip goes with the grain. Now, if I've got this board, say from here, and I've seen some people do this before, I got that board and I'm laying it out like this, and I just need to make a cut here. The problem is, it's got 3 or 4 feet over here and about 4 feet out there. If I start cutting that board, as that board starts to go down, it will pinch my blade right about there. Okay? So a lot of times you'll just take it and lay a flat board like that, or have somebody hold that in without lifting up or pushing down. Okay? Likewise, I don't want to put a board like this, have the high spot over here, and put my weight in the middle here, because when that board starts to cut, boom, it moves down like that, and it will pinch that blade again, and it will kick back on you again. So be real careful with cutting long boards, and that you have a configuration something like this. Hey, the great thing about these videos, you can keep watching over and over again. You don't remember everything in the first session? Well, just go and practice some more, and you go like, oh, wait a minute, what did he say about this? Go back and watch the video again, learn a little bit more, go out in your shop, give it a spin, do some test cuts, do a little practicing. That's the great thing about the Sawdust Dude. It's about learning the skills for better results. And that all depends on you watching. So keep watching the Sawdust Dude, and I'll see you real soon. Oh yeah!